Chapter 7 of Book 8 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Kuiper. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo, translated by Elizabeth Florence Hapgood. Book 8, Enchantments and Desolations. Chapter 7, The Old Heart and the Young Heart, in the presence of each other. At that epoch, Father Gillenormand was well past his 91st birthday. He still lived with Mademoiselle Gillenormand in the Rue des Filles du Calvaire, numero 6, in the old house which he owned. He was, as the reader will remember, one of those antique old men who await death perfectly erect, whom age bears down without bending, and whom even sorrow cannot curve. Still, his daughter had been saying for some time, "My father is sinking." He no longer boxed the maid's ears. He no longer thumped the landing place so vigorously with his cane when Basque was slow in opening the door. The Revolution of July had exasperated him for the space of barely 6 months. He had viewed almost tranquilly that coupling of words in the Moniteur, Monsieur Humboldt, Comte, Peer of France. The fact is that the old man was deeply dejected. He did not bend, he did not yield. This was no more a characteristic of his physical than of his moral nature. But he felt himself giving way internally. For 4 years he had been waiting for Marius, with his foot firmly planted, that is the exact word, in the conviction that that good-for-nothing young scamp would ring at his door some day or other. Now he had reached the point where, at certain gloomy hours, he said to himself that if Marius made him wait much longer, it was not death that was insupportable to him. It was the idea that perhaps he should never see Marius again. The idea of never seeing Marius again had never entered his brain until that day. Now the thought began to recur to him, and it chilled him. Absence, as is always the case in genuine and natural sentiments, had only served to augment the grandfather's love for the ungrateful child, who had gone off like a flash. It is during December nights, when the cold stands at 10 degrees, that one thinks oftenest of the sun. Monsieur Gillenormand was, or thought himself above all things, incapable of taking a single step, he, the grandfather, towards his grandson. "I would die rather," he said to himself. He did not consider himself as the least to blame, but he thought of Marius only with profound tenderness and the mute despair of an elderly, kindly old man who is about to vanish in the dark. He began to lose his teeth, which added to his sadness. Monsieur Gillenormand, without, however, acknowledging it to himself, for it would have rendered him furious and ashamed, had never loved a mistress as he loved Marius. He had had placed in his chamber, opposite the head of his bed, so that it should be the first thing on which his eyes fell on waking, an old portrait of his other daughter, who was dead, Madame Pontmercy, a portrait which had been taken when she was 18. He gazed incessantly at that portrait. One day, he happened to say, as he gazed upon it, "I think the likeness is strong." "To my sister?" inquired Mademoiselle Gillenormand. "Yes, certainly." The old man added, "And to him also." Once, as he sat with his knees pressed together and his eyes almost closed, in a despondent attitude, his daughter ventured to say to him, "Father, are you as angry with him as ever?" She paused, not daring to proceed further. "With whom?" he demanded. "With that poor Marius." He raised his aged head, laid his withered and emaciated fist on the table, and exclaimed in his most irritated and vibrant tone,
poor Marius, do you say? That gentleman is a knave, a wretched scoundrel, a vain little ingrate, a heartless, soulless, haughty, and wicked man.
And he turned away so that his daughter might not see the tear that stood in his eye. 3 days later, he broke a silence which had lasted 4 hours to say to his daughter point blank:
I had the honor to ask Mademoiselle Gillenormand never to mention him to me.
Aunt Gillenormand renounced every effort and pronounced this acute diagnosis:
My father never cared very much for my sister after her folly. It is clear that he detests Marius.
After her folly meant after she had married the colonel. However, as the reader has been able to conjecture, Mademoiselle Gillenormand had failed in her attempt to substitute her favorite, the officer of lancers, for Marius. The substitute, Théodule, had not been a success. Monsieur Gillenormand had not accepted the quid pro quo. A vacancy in the heart does not accommodate itself to a stopgap. Théodule, on his side, though he scented the inheritance, was disgusted at the task of pleasing. The good man bored the lancer, and the lancer shocked the good man. Lieutenant Théodule was gay, no doubt, but a chatterbox, frivolous but vulgar, a high liver, but a frequenter of bad company. He had mistresses, it is true, and he had a great deal to say about them, it is true also, but he talked badly. All his good qualities had a defect. Monsieur Gillenormand was worn out with hearing him tell about the love affairs that he had in the vicinity of the barracks in the Rue de Babylone. And then Lieutenant Gillenormand sometimes came in his uniform with the tricolored cockade. This rendered him downright intolerable. Finally, Father Gillenormand had said to his daughter:
I've had enough of that Théodule. I haven't much taste for warriors in time of peace. Receive him if you choose. I don't know, but I prefer slashers to fellows that drag their swords. The clash of blades in battle is less dismal, after all, than the clank of the scabbard on the pavement. And then throwing out your chest like a bully and lacing yourself like a girl with stays under your cuirass is doubly ridiculous. When one is a veritable man, one holds equally aloof from swagger and from affected airs. He is neither a blusterer nor a finicky-hearted man. Keep your Théodule for yourself.
It was in vain that his daughter said to him:
But he is your grandnephew, nevertheless.
It turned out that Monsieur Gillenormand, who was a grandfather to the very fingertips, was not in the least a grand uncle. In fact, as he had good sense, and as he had compared the two, Théodule had only served to make him regret Marius all the more. One evening, it was the 24th of June, which did not prevent Father Gillenormand having a rousing fire on the hearth, he had dismissed his daughter, who was sewing in a neighboring apartment. He was alone in his chamber amidst its pastoral scenes, with his feet propped on the andirons, half enveloped in his huge screen of Coromandel lacquer, with its 9 leaves, with his elbow resting on a table where burned 2 candles under a green shade, engulfed in his tapestry armchair, and in his hand a book which he was not reading. He was dressed according to his wont like an incroyable, and resembled an antique portrait by Garat. This would have made people run after him in the street had not his daughter covered him up whenever he went out in a vast bishop's wadded cloak, which concealed his attire. At home he never wore a dressing gown, except when he rose and retired.
It gives one a look of age, said he.
Father Gillenormand was thinking of Marius lovingly and bitterly, and, as usual, bitterness predominated. His tenderness, once soured, always ended by boiling and turning to indignation.